The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of the Arizona Territory as Sarah McKenna stepped out of the small wooden cabin that had been her home for the past 3 years. The year was 1885, and the tensions between the white settlers and the Apache tribes ran as deep as the canyons that carved through this unforgiving landscape. Sarah pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the crisp autumn air bite through the thin fabric. At 24, Sarah had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. Her parents had died in a cholera outbreak when she was 16, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that offered few opportunities for unmarried women. She had worked as a seamstress, a cook, and even tried her hand at teaching before finally finding employment at the Circle M Ranch, owned by Marcus Whitfield, a stern man whose hatred for the Apache was matched only by his love for his cattle. The Circle M Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, bordered by rocky outcroppings and dense clusters of mesquite trees. Whitfield had built his empire through shrewd business dealings and an iron will, but also through his unwavering belief that the Apache were nothing more than savage obstacles to progress. His ranch hands shared his views, and the few who didn't learn quickly to keep their opinions to themselves. Sarah's job at the ranch was to care for the household, cook meals for the dozen ranch hands, and tend to any medical needs that arose. She had learned basic nursing skills from her mother, who had been the closest thing their small town had to a doctor. This knowledge had proven invaluable on the ranch, where accidents were common and the nearest real doctor was a day's ride away. As she walked toward the main house to begin preparing breakfast, Sarah noticed something unusual near the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the ranch property. A figure lay motionless beside the water, partially hidden by the tall grass and cattails. Her heart racing, she approached cautiously, unsure if it was a drunk ranch hand or something more dangerous. What she found made her gasp. It was a young Apache man, probably no more than 20 years old, lying unconscious with blood seeping from a deep wound in his side. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Sarah recognized as a sign of significant blood loss. A crude bandage made from what appeared to be torn cloth had been wrapped around the injury, but it was soaked through and had done little to stop the bleeding. Sarah's first instinct was to run back to the ranch house and alert Mr. Whitfield, but something stopped her. She knew what would happen if she did. Whitfield and his men would likely finish what someone else had started. The Apache man would be killed without question, regardless of how he had come to be injured or whether he posed any threat. She looked around quickly to make sure no one from the ranch could see her, then knelt beside the wounded man. Up close, she could see that he was young, with strong features and long black hair that was matted with sweat and dirt. His clothes were simple but well-made, consisting of buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt that had once been white but was now stained with blood and dust. Sarah had never been this close to an Apache before. The stories she had heard painted them as bloodthirsty savages who killed without mercy and took scalps as trophies. But looking at this unconscious young man, she saw only another human being in desperate need of help. The wound in his side appeared to be from a bullet, and from the amount of blood he had lost, she guessed he had been lying there for hours. Making a decision that would change her life forever, Sarah carefully examined the wound. The bullet appeared to have passed through without hitting any vital organs, but the entry and exit wounds needed immediate attention. She knew she couldn't move him to the cabin without being seen, and she couldn't leave him there to die. Working quickly, she removed her apron and tore into strips to make fresh bandages. She used water from the creek to clean the wounds as best she could, wincing at the amount of blood that flowed away with the water. The Apache man stirred slightly when she touched the wound, letting out a low moan, but didn't regain consciousness. Sarah had seen enough gunshot wounds to know that infection was often more dangerous than the initial injury. She needed proper medical supplies, but getting them would mean explaining why she needed them. Instead, she made do with what nature provided. She gathered some willow bark from the trees along the creek, knowing it had pain-relieving properties, and found some wild comfrey, which her mother had taught her could help wounds heal. After cleaning and rebandaging the wounds with her makeshift supplies, Sarah faced another dilemma. The Apache man was too heavy for her to move alone, and he was lying in a spot where he would almost certainly be discovered once the ranch hands began their daily routines. She needed to find somewhere safe to hide him until he was strong enough to leave on his own. About a quarter-mile upstream, Sarah remembered seeing an old line shack that had been abandoned years ago when Whitfield expanded the main ranch buildings. It was hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees and far enough from the main ranch to avoid casual discovery. If she could somehow get the wounded man there, she might be able to keep him hidden while he recovered. The sound of voices from the direction of the ranch house told her that the other hands were beginning to stir. Soon they would be heading out to check the cattle and mend fences, and someone might decide to water their horse at the creek. Time was running out. Sarah made another difficult decision. She would have to leave the Apache man where he was for now and come back later with help. But first, she needed to make sure he stayed hidden until she could return. She gathered armfuls of tall grass and carefully arranged them around his body, creating a natural screen that would make him nearly invisible unless someone was looking directly at the spot. Hurrying back to the ranch house, Sarah tried to act normally as she began preparing breakfast for the hands. Her mind raced with plans and possibilities, but she forced herself to focus on the routine tasks that would keep her activities from seeming suspicious. Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, was the first to enter the kitchen. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for Whitfield for over a decade. Sarah had always found him to be fair and decent, unlike some of the other hands, but she knew his loyalty to Whitfield was absolute. "Morning, Sarah," Tom said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had prepared. "You're up early today." "Couldn't sleep," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thought I'd get a head start on the day." Tom nodded and settled into his usual chair at the long wooden table. "Weather's turning. Looks like we might get some rain before the week's out. That'd be good for the grass, but it'll make moving those cattle to the south pasture more difficult." Sarah nodded absently, her thoughts still focused on the wounded Apache man by the creek. She needed to find a way to get him to safety, but she also needed help. The question was who she could trust with such a dangerous secret. As the other ranch hands filed into the kitchen for breakfast, Sarah studied each of their faces, trying to determine if any of them might be sympathetic to her cause. Most of them were rough men who had come west seeking adventure or escaping troubled pasts. They were loyal to Whitfield because he paid them well and treated them fairly, but their attitudes toward the Apache ranged from suspicion to outright hatred. There was young Billy Harper, barely 18 and new to the ranch. He seemed decent enough, but Sarah wasn't sure he could be trusted with such a weighty secret. Then there was Jake Morrison, a quiet man who kept to himself and never participated in the anti-Apache rhetoric that sometimes filled the bunkhouse. Sarah had always wondered if his silence indicated sympathy or simply disinterest. As the men ate their breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, the conversation turned to recent Apache raids in the area. A neighboring ranch had lost some cattle the week before, and there were rumors that a war party was moving through the territory. "Whitfield's talking about organizing a patrol," Tom said, cutting into his eggs. "He wants to make sure our boundaries are secure." "About time," growled Pete Kellerman, a burly man with graying hair and a permanent scowl. "These savages need to learn that there are consequences for their actions." Sarah's blood ran cold at the thought of Whitfield's men patrolling the ranch boundaries. If they found the wounded Apache man, he would be killed without question. She needed to act quickly. After the hands had finished eating and headed out to begin their daily work, Sarah quickly cleaned the kitchen and gathered some supplies. She took some clean cloth from the linen closet, along with a small bottle of whiskey that she knew Whitfield kept for medicinal purposes. She also packed some bread and dried meat, knowing the Apache man would need food when he regained consciousness. The hardest part was getting away from the ranch house without being seen. Sarah waited until she saw Tom and the other hands riding toward the south pasture before slipping out of the kitchen and heading toward the creek. She carried her supplies in a canvas bag, trying to look like she was simply going to do some washing by the water. When she reached the spot where she had left the wounded Apache man, her heart sank. He was gone. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter, but the blood-stained grass and torn strips of her apron told her it had been real. Someone had moved him, but who? Sarah searched the area frantically, looking for signs of where he might have gone. She found a trail of blood drops leading away from the creek and into the mesquite thicket beyond. Following the trail, she pushed through the thorny bushes, ignoring the scratches on her arms and face. The trail led to a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek. There, propped against a large boulder, was the Apache man. He was conscious now, his dark eyes watching her approach with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. His hand rested on the handle of a knife at his belt, but Sarah could see that he was too weak to pose any real threat. "I'm here to help you," Sarah said softly, stopping several feet away and showing her hands to indicate she was unarmed. She wasn't sure if he understood English, but she hoped her tone would convey her peaceful intentions. The Apache man studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her simple dress and the medical supplies she carried. When he spoke, his English was clear but heavily accented. "Why?" he asked simply. The question caught Sarah off guard. Why was she helping him? She could have easily walked away and pretended she had never seen him. It would have been the safe thing to do, the expected thing. But something deep inside her refused to let another human being suffer when she had the power to help. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said finally. The Apache man continued to watch her, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. Finally, he nodded slightly and removed his hand from his knife. "I'm called Swift Arrow," he said. "I'm grateful for your kindness, but you put yourself in danger by helping me." Sarah moved closer and knelt beside him, examining the makeshift bandages she had applied earlier. Blood was beginning to seep through again, and she could see that he was still in considerable pain. "My name is Sarah," she said as she began to unwrap the old bandages. "And I know I'm putting myself in danger, but I couldn't just leave you there to die." As she cleaned and redressed his wounds with the fresh supply she had brought, Swift Arrow told her how he had come to be injured. He had been hunting alone when he encountered a group of white men driving stolen cattle across Apache land. "We tried to turn them back. They shot him and left him for dead. They wore the brands of several different ranches," he said, wincing as Sarah applied pressure to stop the bleeding. "I believe they were thieves, not legitimate ranchers." Sarah nodded, having heard rumors of cattle rustlers operating in the area. It made sense that they would try to use Apache land to move their stolen herds, knowing that few white lawmen would follow them there. "You need to rest and let these wounds heal," Sarah said as she finished bandaging his side. "But you can't stay here. It's too close to the ranch, and the men will be patrolling the area soon." Swift Arrow struggled to stand, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed back against the boulder. It was clear that he was too weak to travel any significant distance. "There's an old cabin about a mile upstream," Sarah said, making another impulsive decision. "It's abandoned and hidden in the trees. If I could get you there, you'd be safe while you recover." "You have already done too much," Swift Arrow protested. "If your people discover you have helped me, let me worry about that," Sarah said firmly. "Right now, the important thing is getting you somewhere safe." She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they began the slow journey toward the abandoned cabin. Every step was an effort for Swift Arrow, and Sarah could feel his strength ebbing as they walked. She began to worry that he might not make it to the cabin alive. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes stretched into over an hour. They had to stop frequently to rest, and Sarah constantly watched for signs that they might be discovered. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance sent them scrambling for cover behind a cluster of rocks until the riders passed. When they finally reached the old line shack, Sarah was relieved to find it in better condition than she had remembered. The roof was intact, and while the interior was dusty and filled with cobwebs, it would provide adequate shelter. She helped Swift Arrow to a corner where she could make a bed from some old horse blankets she found in a trunk. "You must go now," Swift Arrow said as she settled him onto the makeshift bed. "Your absence will be noticed." Sarah knew he was right, but she was reluctant to leave him alone in his weakened condition. "I'll try to come back tonight with more supplies," she promised. "Food, medicine, whatever I can manage." "Sarah," Swift Arrow called softly as she reached the door. When she turned back, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you. Your kindness will not be forgotten." As Sarah made her way back to the ranch house, she tried to prepare herself for the lies she would need to tell. She would say she had been washing clothes by the creek or gathering wild herds for cooking. Whatever story would explain her absence without arousing suspicion. But as she approached the main yard, she saw Marcus Whitfield standing on the porch with his arms crossed, his face dark with anger. Beside him stood Tom Bradley, holding her canvas bag with the medical supplies. "Where have you been, Miss McKenna?" Whitfield's voice was cold and dangerous. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized that her secret had been discovered. How much did they know? Had they found Swift Arrow? Her mind raced through possible explanations, but She knew that whatever she said, her life at the Circle M Ranch was about to come to an abrupt end. The confrontation that would define the rest of her life was about to begin, and Sarah McKenna had no idea that in helping one wounded Apache warrior, she had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, courage, and the true meaning of humanity in a land where such qualities were often in short supply. The sun was now high overhead, casting harsh shadows across the dusty yard as Sarah walked toward her fate, knowing that her decision to save a life had irreversibly changed her own. The silence that hung in the air as Sarah approached Marcus Whitfield was more threatening than any storm she had ever witnessed. The ranch owner's steel-gray eyes bore into her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably beside his boss, the canvas bag containing the medical supplies hanging from his weathered hand like evidence of her betrayal. "I asked you a question, Miss McKenna," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Where have you been? And why were these supplies found hidden near the creek?" Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet Whitfield's gaze. She had always known this moment might come, though she had hoped to have more time to prepare. The truth was impossible, but a lie might buy swift arrow precious time to recover and escape. "I was gathering willow bark for medicine," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I thought we might need it if any of the men got injured during the cattle drive next week." Whitfield's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the skepticism in his eyes. He stepped down from the porch, his boots clicking against the wooden planks with measured precision. Even at 55, Marcus Whitfield was an imposing figure. Tall and lean, with graying hair and a mustache that he kept meticulously trimmed, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had carved his empire from the harsh Arizona wilderness through sheer force of will. "Willow bark," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "And you needed medical supplies to gather willow bark?" "I wanted to be prepared in case I encountered any injured animals," Sarah replied, the lie feeling like ash in her mouth. "Sometimes the wild horses get tangled in barbed wire, and—" "Enough." Whitfield's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. "Tom, tell Miss McKenna what you told me." The foreman cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sarah had always considered Tom Bradley to be a fair man, but she could see the conflict in his weathered features. His loyalty to Whitfield was absolute, but she sensed that he took no pleasure in what he was about to reveal. "I was checking the fence line along the creek this morning," Tom said, his eyes focused on the ground rather than meeting Sarah's gaze. "I found blood in the grass, quite a bit of it. Fresh blood. And these supplies were hidden nearby, along with strips of cloth that looked like they'd been used for bandages." Sarah's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain calm. They suspected the truth, but they didn't have proof. Swift Arrow was still safe in the abandoned cabin, and as long as she could keep Whitfield's attention focused on her, he might remain that way. "There are many explanations for blood near a creek," she said carefully. "Wild animals, coyotes hunting rabbits." The amount of blood suggested something larger than a rabbit. "Miss McKenna," Whitfield interrupted. "Something human-sized." The ranch owner began to pace in front of her, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Sarah of a predator circling its prey. The other ranch hands had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the obvious tension in the air. She could see curiosity and suspicion in their faces, and knew that word of this confrontation would spread quickly throughout the territory. "In my 20 years in this territory," Whitfield continued, "I have learned to read the signs that lesser men might miss. The blood trail you attempted to conceal, the deliberate placement of grass to hide evidence, the careful selection of medical supplies. These are not the actions of someone tending to wounded animals." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only provide him with more ammunition. Whitfield stopped pacing and turned to face her directly, his expression cold and calculating. 3 days ago, a cavalry patrol reported pursuing a wounded Apache raider into this area, he said. "The trail went cold somewhere near our eastern boundary. I believe you know where that Apache is, Miss McKenna." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she fought to keep her expression neutral. A cavalry patrol had been chasing Swift Arrow. That meant the young Apache might be more than just a hunter who had encountered cattle rustlers. But it also meant that helping him could be considered treason against the United States government. "I don't know anything about any Apache," she said, proud that her voice didn't waver despite the fear coursing through her veins. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, then nodded at Tom Bradley. "Search her quarters," he ordered. "Look for anything that might indicate where she's been hiding him." "That's not necessary," Sarah said quickly, but Tom was already heading toward her cabin. She knew he wouldn't find anything incriminating there, but the search felt like a violation nonetheless. While they waited for Tom to return, Whitfield continued his questioning. "Miss McKenna, I want you to understand the gravity of the situation. Harboring an Apache raider is not only dangerous to everyone on this ranch, it's a federal offense. The cavalry has authority to arrest anyone who provides aid and comfort to hostile Indians. And I want you to understand something, Mr. Whitfield," Sarah replied, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "I took an oath before God to help those in need, regardless of their race or circumstances. If I encountered someone who was wounded and dying, I would help them whether they were Apache, Mexican, or white." A murmur ran through the gathered ranch hands at her words. Some looked shocked at her boldness in challenging Whitfield directly, while others seemed to admire her courage. Sarah noticed that young Billy Harper was nodding slightly, and even Jake Morrison's usually impassive face showed a flicker of what might have been approval. Whitfield's face darkened at her defiance. "Your Christian charity is admirable, Miss McKenna, but misplaced. The Apache are not merely different from us. They are enemies of civilization itself. They raid our settlements, murder our women and children, and steal our livestock. They are savages who understand only force. From what I've heard, we've done our share of killing too," Sarah said, thinking of the stories she had heard about massacres of Apache women and children. "Maybe if we tried treating them like human beings instead of animals to be exterminated, we might find a different path to peace." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah immediately regretted speaking so freely. Whitfield's expression had gone from angry to dangerous, and she could see several of the ranch hands shifting uncomfortably. In this part of the territory, her words bordered on sedition. "Miss McKenna," Whitfield said slowly, "you seem to have forgotten that you are a guest on my property, employed at my discretion. Your radical ideas about Indian relations are not welcome here." Tom Bradley chose that moment to return from searching Sarah's cabin. He shook his head when Whitfield looked at him questioningly. "Nothing there, boss. Just her personal belongings and some dried herbs she uses for cooking." Sarah felt a moment of relief, but she knew the respite would be temporary. Whitfield was not a man to give up easily, and she could see the determination in his eyes. He was convinced that she had helped the wounded Apache, and he would not rest until he had proof. "Very well," Whitfield said. "Since you claim to know nothing about this matter, you won't object to accompanying me and my men on a search of the area. We'll start with the creek and work our way out from there." Sarah's blood ran cold. If they conducted a thorough search, they would inevitably discover the abandoned cabin and Swift Arrow's hiding place. The young Apache was still too weak to escape on his own, and Whitfield's men would show him no mercy. "I have duties to attend to here at the ranch," she said desperately. "The men need their midday meal prepared, and the men can prepare their own meal for one day." Whitfield cut her off. "This matter takes precedence. Unless, of course, you have some objection to helping us search for a dangerous criminal." Sarah realized she was trapped. Refusing to participate in the search would be tantamount to admitting her guilt, but joining it would likely lead them directly to Swift Arrow. She needed time to think, time to warn him, but Whitfield was giving her neither. "Of course I'll help," she said finally, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "When do we start?" "Immediately," Whitfield replied, then turned to address the gathered ranch hands. "Tom, take Billy and Jake and search the area around the creek. Pete, you and the others check the gullies and rock formations to the south. Miss McKenna and I will examine the northern boundary." Sarah's heart leaped. The northern boundary was on the opposite side of the ranch from where she had hidden Swift Arrow. If she could keep Whitfield occupied there long enough, perhaps she could think of a way to warn the wounded Apache of the danger. As the search party dispersed, Sarah found herself walking alongside Marcus Whitfield toward the northern edge of his property. The ranch owner maintained a steady pace despite the heat of the midday sun, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of disturbance. "You know, Miss McKenna," he said as they walked, "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. Your sympathy for the Apache is interesting. Tell me, What has given you such compassionate feelings toward our enemies? Sarah sensed a trap in the question, but decided that honesty might serve her better than continued evasion. I suppose it comes from my upbringing, Mr. Whitfield. My parents taught me that all people are children of God, regardless of their race or culture. Admirable sentiments, Whitfield replied, though his tone suggested he found them anything but admirable. But sometimes the reality of frontier life requires us to set aside such idealistic notions. The Apache don't share your Christian values, Miss McKenna. To them, we are invaders to be driven from their land by any means necessary. Maybe they have a point, Sarah said quietly. This was their land long before we arrived. Whitfield stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression incredulous. Are you suggesting that we should simply abandon our homes and businesses because the Apache were here first? That we should allow savagery to triumph over civilization? I'm suggesting that there might be ways to share the land without constant warfare, Sarah replied. Other territories have managed to establish peaceful relations with their Indian populations. Through strength and superior firepower, Whitfield said firmly. The Apache respect only power, Miss McKenna. Every attempt at peaceful negotiation has ended in betrayal and bloodshed. The only language they understand is force. As they continued their search of the northern boundary, Whitfield regaled Sarah with stories of Apache raids and atrocities that he claimed to have witnessed firsthand. She listened with growing unease, recognizing that some of his tales were likely exaggerated or entirely fictional, designed to reinforce his prejudices and justify his hatred. But she also knew that there had been genuine atrocities on both sides of the conflict. The Apache had indeed raided white settlements, killing innocent people and taking captives. But she had also heard stories of white soldiers and civilians murdering Apache women and children, burning their villages and driving them from their ancestral lands. The cycle of violence seemed endless, fed by fear, hatred, and the unwillingness of either side to see their enemies as fully human. Sarah wondered if Swift Arrow had participated in such raids, or if he was simply a young man caught up in circumstances beyond his control. After 2 hours of searching the northern boundary, they had found no trace of an Apache presence. Whitfield seemed frustrated by the lack of evidence, but Sarah could see that his suspicion of her had not diminished. If anything, her defense of Apache rights had only strengthened his conviction that she was involved in harboring the wounded warrior. As they made their way back toward the ranch buildings, they encountered Tom Bradley riding hard across the grassland. The foreman's face was grim as he approached, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with dread. "Boss," Tom called out as he reined in his horse, "we found something you need to see." Whitfield's eyes lit up with anticipation. "What is it, Tom?" "Blood trail leading away from the creek," Tom replied, not looking at Sarah. "Looks like someone tried to cover it up, but we managed to follow it for about a quarter mile before it disappeared into the rocks." Sarah's mind raced. They had found the trail she and Swift Arrow had left when they traveled to the abandoned cabin. It was only a matter of time before they expanded their search and discovered his hiding place. "Show me," Whitfield ordered, his voice filled with satisfaction. As they followed Tom toward the area where the blood trail had been discovered, Sarah desperately tried to think of a way to warn Swift Arrow. But with Whitfield watching her every move, she had no opportunity to slip away undetected. The trail led to the rocky area where she and Swift Arrow had hidden from the passing riders. Sarah could see that the Apache had done his best to conceal their passage, but the experienced eyes of Whitfield's men had managed to pick up the signs despite his efforts. "From here, the trail becomes more difficult to follow," Tom explained. "Whoever we're tracking knew something about covering their movement, but there are still traces if you know what to look for." Whitfield knelt down to examine some disturbed earth near a large boulder. "Two sets of tracks," he observed, one much heavier than the other, suggesting someone was being supported or carried. Sarah watched in growing alarm as the ranch owner's tracking skills led them ever closer to the abandoned cabin. She had underestimated both his determination and his ability to read the subtle signs left by their passage. "The tracks lead toward the old line shack," Tom said, confirming Sarah's worst fears. "Should we check it out?" "Indeed we should," Whitfield replied, rising to his feet and dusting off his hands. "Miss McKenna, you seem rather pale. Are you feeling unwell?" "It's the heat," Sarah managed to say, though she felt anything but hot. Her hands were cold and clammy, and her heart was beating so fast she was sure everyone could hear it. "Perhaps you should return to the ranch house," Whitfield suggested, but his tone made it clear that this was not a genuine offer. "Though on second thought, I think your presence might be valuable when we discover what's waiting for us at that cabin." As they approached the grove of cottonwood trees that concealed the abandoned line shack, Sarah found herself praying for a miracle. Perhaps Swift Arrow had somehow sensed the danger and managed to escape despite his wounds. Perhaps the cabin would be empty, and she could convince Whitfield that they had been following a false trail. But as they drew closer to the old building, she could see smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, barely visible stream. Swift Arrow was still there, probably trying to stay warm and fight off fever from his wounds. In a few minutes, Marcus Whitfield would have the evidence he needed to destroy both their lives. The confrontation that would determine their fate was about to begin, and Sarah McKenna realized that her small act of compassion had set in motion events that would test not only her courage, but the very foundations of justice and humanity in a land where such concepts were often secondary to the harsh demands of survival. The thin wisp of smoke rising from the abandoned cabin's chimney seemed to hang in the still air like a death sentence. Sarah watched Marcus Whitfield's face transform from suspicion to cold satisfaction as he spotted the telltale sign of occupancy. Tom Bradley pulled his rifle from its saddle holster, and the other ranch hands who had joined them spread out in a loose semicircle around the building. "Well, Miss McKenna," Whitfield said softly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of a predator that had cornered its prey, "it appears your willow bark gathering expedition has led us to quite an interesting discovery." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of some explanation, some way to protect Swift Arrow from what was about to unfold. The young Apache was still weak from blood loss and fever. He had no chance of escaping or defending himself against 6 armed men who viewed him as nothing more than a dangerous animal to be eliminated. "Mr. Whitfield," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Save your lives for someone more gullible," he said. "Tom, circle around to the back of the cabin. Billy, you and Jake cover the windows. Pete, watch the door. I want this savage taken alive if possible." "Alive?" Pete Kellerman asked, surprise evident in his gruff voice. "Boss, wouldn't it be easier to just—" "Alive," Whitfield repeated firmly. "The cavalry will want to question him about recent raids in the territory. Besides, I'm curious to learn how long Miss McKenna has been harboring Apache spies on my property." The word spies hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Whitfield convinced the authorities that she had been providing information to Apache raiders, she could face charges of treason. The punishment for such crimes in frontier territory was often death. As the men took their positions around the cabin, Sarah made a desperate decision. She couldn't allow Swift Arrow to be captured without warning. Whatever the consequences to herself, she had to give him a chance to escape or at least prepare for what was coming. "Swift Arrow," she called out loudly, breaking away from Whitfield's side and running toward the cabin door. "Run! They found you!" Behind her, she heard Whitfield curse and shout orders to his men, but she had managed to cover half the distance to the cabin before strong hands grabbed her arms and pulled her back. Pete Kellerman's grip was like iron as he dragged her away from the building. "Let me go." Sarah struggled against the burly ranch hand, but his strength was far greater than hers. "You don't understand. He's wounded and sick. He's no threat to anyone." "Shut her up, Pete," Whitfield snarled, his face dark with rage. "Miss McKenna, your heroic warning may have just cost that Apache his life. If he tries to run in his condition, my men will have no choice but to shoot him down." The cabin door opened slowly, and Swift Arrow emerged with his hands raised. Even at a distance, Sarah could see how much the effort cost him. He was pale and unsteady on his feet, but his dark eyes showed no fear as he faced the guns pointed at him. "I am unarmed," Swift Arrow called out in clear English. "I claim the right to speak before you kill me." Whitfield stepped forward, his own rifle trained on the young Apache's chest. "You're in no position to claim anything, savage. You're on my land, being harbored by one of my employees. That makes you a trespasser and a spy." "I am neither," Swift Arrow replied with quiet dignity. "I am Swift Arrow, son of Chief Gray Wolf of the Chiricahua Apache. I was wounded by cattle thieves who shot me when I tried to turn them back from Apache land. This woman found me dying and saved my life out of kindness. She has done nothing wrong. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the young warrior's courage. Despite his weakness and the hopelessness of his situation, he was trying to protect her from the consequences of helping him. Cattle thieves. Whitfield scoffed. A convenient story. I suppose you have proof of these alleged thieves. They branded several different ranches, Swift Arrow said. Circle M was among them. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah saw Whitfield's face flush with anger. The implication was clear. Someone had been using the Circle M brand to steal cattle, possibly with Whitfield's knowledge or participation. You lying dog, Pete Kellerman growled, raising his rifle. How dare you accuse Mr. Whitfield of rustling? I accuse no one, Swift Arrow said calmly. I simply state what I saw. Perhaps Mr. Whitfield's brand was stolen along with his cattle. Sarah could see the calculation in Whitfield's eyes as he processed this information. If there really were cattle rustlers using his brand, it could damage his reputation and business relationships throughout the territory. But admitting that Apache claims might have merit would undermine his entire philosophy about Indian relations. Even if your story were true, Whitfield said finally, it doesn't change the fact that you're an Apache warrior on white man's land. The cavalry has been hunting you for days. What raids have you participated in? What information have you passed to your people about our defenses? I have raided no settlements, Swift Arrow replied. I was hunting alone when I encountered the thieves. I have been unconscious or recovering from my wounds ever since. I know nothing of raids or military information. Tom Bradley had returned from his circuit around the cabin, and Sarah noticed him whispering something in Whitfield's ear. The ranch owner's expression grew even darker as he listened to his foreman's report. Tom tells me he found evidence of a camp in the rocks about a mile from here, Whitfield said. Apache sign, several days old. Were you meeting with other warriors when these alleged cattle thieves shot you? Swift Arrow hesitated for the first time, and Sarah sensed there was more to his story than he had revealed. I was returning from a meeting with elders of my tribe. We had been discussing terms for a possible peace council with white officials. Peace council. Whitfield laughed harshly. The Apache don't want peace. They want to drive us from our lands. Every peace council has ended in betrayal and bloodshed. That is not true, Swift Arrow said with surprising firmness. There are many among my people who are weary of war. We have lost too many of our young men, too many of our children. Some of our leaders believe it may be time to find a way to share the land. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she listened to this exchange. The idea that there might be Apache leaders genuinely interested in peace was revolutionary in a territory where conflict seemed endless and inevitable. But Whitfield was unmoved by Swift Arrow's words. Even if I believed you, which I don't, it doesn't matter. You're still an Apache warrior who has been harbored by one of my employees. That makes both of you enemies of civilization. Mr. Whitfield, Sarah called out, finding her voice despite Pete Kellerman's grip on her arms. If he's telling the truth about the Peace Council, turning him over to the cavalry could destroy any chance for negotiations. Think about what that could mean for the territory. Whitfield turned his cold gaze on her. Miss McKenna, your concern for Apache welfare is touching, but misguided. There can be no peace with savages who refuse to accept the superiority of white civilization. The only solution to the Indian problem is complete subjugation or removal. You're wrong, Sarah said desperately. There has to be another way. Swift Arrow is proof that the Apache can be reasoned with, that they're capable of honor and dignity. Swift Arrow is proof only that some white women are foolish enough to be deceived by savage cunning. Whitfield replied. Tom, ride to Fort Bowie and inform the cavalry that we've captured their fugitive. Tell them we're holding him here until they arrive. Wait, Swift Arrow called out as Tom started toward his horse. There is something else you should know before you make that decision. Whitfield paused, clearly intrigued, despite himself. What? The cattle thieves I encountered were not common rustlers, Swift Arrow said. They were well-organized, well-armed, and they spoke of having protection from territorial officials. One of them mentioned a name, Colonel Harrison at Fort Bowie. The name hit Whitfield like a thunderbolt. Sarah could see the shock and calculation in his expression as he processed this new information. Colonel Harrison was the military commander responsible for Apache relations in the region, and any suggestion of his involvement in cattle rustling could have far-reaching implications. You expect me to believe that a United States Army colonel is involved with cattle thieves? Whitfield said, but His voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I expect you to consider the possibility," Swift Arrow replied. "Why else would thieves feel safe operating so openly on Apache land?" They knew that any Apache who tried to stop them would be branded a raider, while their own crimes would be overlooked. Sarah could see doubt beginning to creep into the faces of some of Whitfield's men. Billy Harper looked particularly troubled, and even Tom Bradley seemed less certain than he had earlier. "This is all very convenient," Whitfield said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "A wounded Apache happens to discover a cattle rustling operation involving a cavalry officer, and now he wants to use that information to bargain for his freedom." "I offer no bargains," Swift Arrow said with quiet dignity. "I simply tell you what I saw and heard. What you do with that information is your choice." The standoff continued for several long minutes, with Whitfield clearly torn between his desire to turn Swift Arrow over to the cavalry and his growing suspicion that there might be truth to the Apache's claims about Colonel Harrison. Finally, it was Tom Bradley who broke the silence. "Boss," he said carefully, "maybe we should listen to what he has to say. If there really is corruption at Fort Bowie, it could affect all the ranchers in the territory." Whitfield's jaw tightened with frustration. "And if he's lying, Tom? If this is all an elaborate deception designed to sow discord between us and the military?" "Then we turn him over to the cavalry as planned," Tom replied. "But if he's telling the truth, we might be doing ourselves a disservice by not investigating further." Sarah seized on this opening. "Mr. Whitfield, you're a successful businessman because you're willing to consider all possibilities before making important decisions. Isn't it worth taking time to verify Swift Arrow's story before potentially destroying any chance for peace in the territory?" Whitfield studied both Sarah and Swift Arrow for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and measured. "Very well," he said. "I'm willing to postpone turning you over to the cavalry for 24 hours. In that time, you will provide me with detailed information about these alleged cattle thieves, their numbers, their appearance, their methods, and everything they said about Colonel Harrison. If your information proves accurate, I may be willing to consider your claims about peace councils. And if it doesn't?" Swift Arrow asked. "If it doesn't," Whitfield replied grimly, "I'll turn you over to the cavalry personally, and I'll make sure they know about your attempts to spread false accusations against military personnel." Swift Arrow nodded his acceptance of these terms, though Sarah could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The stress of the confrontation, combined with his injuries, was clearly taking a severe toll on his strength. However, Whitfield continued, "There are conditions. You will be confined to the cabin under armed guard. Any attempt to escape will result in your immediate death. And Miss McKenna—" Sarah's heart sank as Whitfield turned his attention back to her. "Miss McKenna will be confined to her quarters pending the resolution of this matter. Her employment with the Circle M Ranch is terminated effective immediately. Whether she faces criminal charges will depend on the outcome of our investigation into your story." "You can't do this," Sarah protested. "I haven't committed any crime. I helped a wounded human being. That's not against the law." "Harboring a fugitive Apache warrior is indeed against territorial law," Whitfield replied coldly. "And if your friend's story proves false, you'll be charged as an accomplice to espionage and attempted sedition." As Pete Kellerman began dragging her toward the ranch buildings, Sarah called out to Swift Arrow one last time. "I don't regret helping you," she said. "Whatever happens, remember that there are white people who believe in justice and peace." Swift Arrow met her eyes and nodded slightly, a gesture that conveyed both gratitude and sorrow. "I will not forget your kindness, Sarah McKenna. Whatever my fate, your compassion has given me hope that peace between our peoples may yet be possible." As they disappeared from each other's sight, neither Sarah nor Swift Arrow could have imagined the remarkable turn of events that would unfold over the next 24 hours. The truth about the cattle rustling operation would prove to be far more complex and dangerous than anyone suspected, involving not just Colonel Harrison, but a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government.